My son stood in my kitchen with his shoulders stiff and his eyes empty. Like he had already decided this conversation was over before it began. His voice was flat, almost rehearsed. "Dad, I need to tell you something," he said. I took the money. I stared at him, waiting for the rest of the sentence. Some explanation, some joke that would dissolve the tight knot forming in my chest. But instead, he continued. "I drained your savings, all of it." Before I could process what those words meant, my daughter-in-law stepped closer. Vanessa Carter Miller moved with the confidence of someone who had already won. She didn't look apologetic. She didn't look nervous. She looked relieved. "We needed it," she said calmly. "My family needed it more than you ever will." That was the moment something inside me shifted. Not anger, not shock, something colder. The quiet, crushing realization that the people I had loved and supported had been studying me for years. Not as a father, not as family, but as a resource. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply nodded, walked past them, and grabbed my coat. I drove to the bank that afternoon with one simple intention: to close an account that no longer belonged to me. The branch was the same one my wife and I had used for decades. Same brick building, same glass doors, same smell of polished wood and paper. Margaret, my Maggie, and I had opened our first joint account there 30 years ago. Back when we were young and believed that hard work guaranteed safety. I approached the counter, ready to demand answers, but before I could speak, a man in a dark suit stepped out from a side office. "Mr. Miller?" he said quietly. "I'm Thomas Whitaker, the branch manager. Would you come with me, please?" There was urgency in his voice, the kind that doesn't invite refusal. Inside his office, he didn't sit behind his desk. He pulled a chair close to mine and lowered his voice. "You need to see this," he said. He turned the screen toward me. Lines of numbers filled the display. Transfers, dates, amounts. My balance, once $47,000, now sat at just over $300. But that wasn't what made my blood turn cold. These transfers didn't just happen once. Thomas continued. They've been happening for 6 months. Small amounts, carefully timed. Whoever did this knew exactly how to avoid triggering alerts. He slid a folder across the desk. And there's more. Inside was a loan application. $30,000. My name, my social security number, a signature that looked almost like mine, but not quite. "That signature is forged," Thomas said quietly. "Your home was used as collateral." I felt the room tilt. My house wasn't just wood and brick. It was the place Maggie and I had built a life. The place where she laughed, where she got sick, where she died. The idea of losing it was unthinkable. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. Thomas hesitated, then said, "Because someone asked me to watch over you." I didn't understand what he meant then. Not fully. That morning had begun like any other. Cold, even for late November in Vermont. Frost clung to the windows of the house Maggie and I had shared for 41 years. She passed 2 years ago. Cancer moving faster than anyone expected. Some days, it still feels like she just stepped into the garden and forgot the time. I keep her white lilies by the kitchen window. She planted them the spring before she got sick. Every morning, I water them and talk to her photograph on the mantel. About the weather, about dinner, about the birds she loved watching from the feeder by the oak tree. It probably sounds foolish, but those conversations keep me steady. That morning, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open. Black coffee cooling beside me. I needed to pay the electric bill and check my savings. A routine I'd done hundreds of times. Then I heard a car in the driveway. Andrew. My son didn't visit often anymore. Since Maggie's funeral, maybe 3 times a year. He lived 2 hours south with Vanessa and their daughter, Lily. I told myself that was normal. Life gets busy. Still, my heart lifted when I saw his car. When I opened the door, I knew immediately something was wrong. Andrew avoided my eyes. His shoulders were tight, his jaw clenched. Vanessa followed him inside like she owned the place. Her heels clicked sharply against the wooden floor Maggie had refinished herself 20 years earlier. "We need to talk," Vanessa said, settling into Maggie's favorite armchair without asking. Andrew stayed standing, fiddling with his coat zipper. What's going on? I asked. Is Lily okay? She's fine, Andrew said quickly. We're just dealing with a financial situation. Family helps family, Vanessa added smoothly. Right? Something in her tone made my stomach tighten. Not desperation, expectation. She glanced toward the kitchen table. You might want to check your accounts, just to make sure everything's in order. When I refreshed the page on my laptop and saw the balance, I thought it had to be a glitch. I refreshed again. Same number. Andrew, I said, my voice barely steady. What is this? He couldn't look at me. It was an emergency, Dad. We were going to pay it back. Vanessa didn't flinch. You should start thinking about your future. Robert, she said calmly, you don't need that kind of money anymore. She talked about my age, about the house being too big, about assisted living, about what would be better for everyone. Better for everyone. I realized then that she wasn't worried about me at all. She was clearing obstacles. When they left, the door slamming shut behind them, the house felt colder than the November air outside. And for the first time, I remembered something Maggie had said years ago. I worry about Vanessa, she'd told me once. She looks at things like she's measuring what she can take. I had dismissed it. Sitting alone at the kitchen table, staring at an account that had been emptied and a life that suddenly felt fragile. I understood. Maggie had seen what I refused to see. And whatever Vanessa had done behind my back wasn't just selfish. It was unforgivable. I couldn't sit in that house another minute. The walls felt closer than they ever had. The silence heavier, as if it were pressing down on my chest. Maggie's lilies stood quietly by the window, their white petals catching the gray afternoon light. And for a moment I almost apologized to her photograph on the mantel for what I was about to do, leave without saying goodbye. I grabbed my keys and coat and drove to the bank. The roads were nearly empty, bare trees lining the highway like skeletal witnesses. As I pulled out of the driveway, I glanced once in the rearview mirror. For a brief second, I thought I saw movement at the living room window. Vanessa, phone pressed to her ear, watching me leave. The thought unsettled me, but I told myself I was imagining things. Stressed as that, or so I believed then. The bank was quiet when I arrived. A few customers stood at the teller windows, murmuring softly, the hum of fluorescent lights filling the space. I approached the counter, my heart pounding, ready to demand an explanation. But before I could speak, a familiar voice interrupted. Mr. Miller. Thomas Whitaker stepped out from his office, his expression serious in a way that made my stomach drop again. Please, he said gently, placing a hand on my arm. Come with me. His office was modest, framed certificates on the wall, a small potted plant in the corner that looked like it needed water, and a window overlooking the parking lot where my truck sat alone. Thomas didn't sit behind his desk. Instead, he pulled a chair close to mine, lowering himself into it as if what he was about to say required trust. I need you to stay calm, he said. Can you do that? I nodded, though my pulse was already racing. He opened a folder and spread several printed pages across the desk. Transaction records, dozens of them, each highlighted, each bearing my account number at the top. These are the unauthorized transfers, Thomas said quietly. $47,000 total, moved in increments small enough to avoid automatic fraud alerts. I stared at the dates. Some weeks had 2 or 3 transfers. Others had 1, spaced carefully apart. Whoever did this hadn't panicked. They'd planned it. My daughter-in-law, I said. Vanessa, she told me this morning they needed the money. Thomas nodded slowly. The destination accounts are linked to her. We traced them within 24 hours of noticing the irregularities. He paused, then reached into the folder again. But that's not what worries me most. He placed a single sheet of paper in front of me. A loan application, $30,000, my name, my social security number, a signature that looked close enough to mine to fool someone who wasn't looking carefully. That signature is forged, Thomas said. The loan was approved 3 months ago. Your house was used as collateral. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The money was devastating, but losing the house, that was unthinkable. Maggie and I had painted those walls with our own hands. I had carried her up the stairs when she was too weak to climb them herself. That house wasn't an asset. It was my life. Why are you telling me all of this? I asked. Why not just report it? Thomas leaned back slightly, his expression shifting. We have reported it, he said, quietly. Our compliance department is investigating. Wire fraud, identity theft, forgery. These are serious crimes. I studied his face. You said you noticed the irregularities. Most managers wouldn't catch something like this. His eyes met mine, steady and searching. Your family, he said carefully. I know them better than you might think. Before I could ask what he meant, he stood and handed me a small white business card. You need legal protection, he said, someone who understands financial crimes. Call Jonathan Reed. He's the best attorney in the state for cases like this. I slipped the card into my coat pocket, its thin edge suddenly feeling like a lifeline. And Mr. Miller, Thomas added, his voice dropping even lower. Don't confront Vanessa, not yet. People like her are dangerous when they feel cornered. As I stood to leave, he looked at me with an intensity that stopped me mid-step. Your wife would have wanted you to make that call, he said softly. The words hit me harder than anything else that day. I drove home in a daze, Thomas's voice echoing in my head. Your wife would have wanted you to make that call. How did he know Maggie well enough to say that? What connection did I not see? When I pulled into the driveway, the sun was already sinking behind the hills. The house looked darker, emptier, as if it too sensed something fundamental had changed. I didn't go inside. I sat in the truck, staring at the lilies through the kitchen window, and felt the weight of exhaustion settle over me. I knew where I needed to go. The cemetery was quiet, dead leaves scattered across the paths, bare branches reaching into the gray sky. I walked the familiar route to Maggie's grave, my boots crunching softly on frozen grass. I wasn't alone. A woman knelt beside the headstone, arranging a small bouquet of white roses in the metal vase. When she heard my footsteps, she turned. Helen Brooks, Maggie's closest friend. They had known each other since college, shared holidays, raised children side by side. After Maggie died, Helen had brought casseroles, called to check on me, then slowly drifted away as grief does that to people. She stood, brushing dirt from her knees, and looked at my face. Whatever she saw made her expression change immediately. Robert, she said softly, what's happened? I tried to answer. I couldn't. The words stuck somewhere between my chest and my throat. Helen didn't press. She stepped closer and took my arm, her grip steady and sure. Come with me, she said. My house is 10 minutes away. I'll make coffee. You can tell me everything. Her kitchen was warm, smelled faintly of cinnamon, a sharp contrast to the cold emptiness I had left behind. She set a mug in front of me and waited. So I told her, about Andrew, about Vanessa, about the missing savings, the forged loan, the warning at the bank. When I finished, my coffee had gone cold. Helen sat quietly for a long moment, then reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. There's something you need to know, she said, something Maggie asked me to keep secret unless the time came when you truly needed it. My heart began to pound again. She was worried about Vanessa, Helen continued. Years before she got sick, she watched her, took notes, and she prepared for the worst. She stood and walked to a small desk in the corner, opening a drawer. Inside was a faded envelope, yellowed at the edges, my name written across the front in handwriting I would recognize anywhere. Below it, a single line. Only open when you feel truly betrayed. Helen placed the envelope in my hands. She gave this to me 2 months before she died, she said quietly. She made me promise to hold onto it until the right moment. I stared at Maggie's handwriting, my chest tight with something that felt like grief and awe all at once. Whatever was inside that envelope, I knew one thing for certain. My wife had known. And she had not left me unprotected. I didn't open the envelope right away. I sat in Helen's kitchen for a long time after she placed it in my hands, turning it over slowly, tracing Maggie's handwriting with my thumb as if the texture of the ink might somehow tell me what she'd been thinking when she sealed it. Part of me was afraid that once I read her words, I would have to accept that my wife had known what was coming long before I ever did, that she had seen the betrayal forming while I was still clinging to the illusion that everything was fine. Helen watched me quietly, understanding without asking. "You don't have to open it now," she said gently. "Maggie told me you'd know when you were ready." I nodded and slid the envelope into my coat pocket. That evening, I called Jonathan Reed. The phone rang twice before a calm, measured voice answered. I told him my name. I mentioned Thomas Whitaker. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "I've been expecting your call, Mr. Miller," Jonathan said. "Can you come to my office tomorrow morning? 9 o'clock. Bring everything you have." His office was in Burlington, on the third floor of an old brick building overlooking Church Street. The waiting room was quiet and professional. Leather chairs arranged neatly, framed diplomas lining the walls. When Jonathan stepped out to greet me, he looked exactly like I had imagined, mid-50s. Silver threaded through dark hair, eyes sharp but not unkind. I laid the documents from the bank across his desk. The transaction records, the forged loan application, Thomas's business card, his handwriting scrawled on the back. Jonathan studied them in silence, his expression growing more serious with every page. "This isn't a misunderstanding," he said finally. "This is organized financial fraud. Planned, executed over months." "My daughter-in-law," I said. "Vanessa." "Almost certainly," he agreed, "but there's something else you should know." He leaned back, studying my reaction. "Your wife came to see me 4 years ago." The room went very still. "Maggie?" I said. "She never told me. She asked me to keep it confidential." Jonathan replied. "She wanted to protect your assets. Your home, especially." He tapped the loan application. "She established a revocable living trust. The house cannot be sold or leveraged without your explicit, notarized consent. Whoever forged this signature didn't know about it." Relief washed over me, quickly followed by a deeper ache. Maggie had protected me from beyond the grave, and carried that burden alone while she was still alive. "What do I do now?" I asked. Jonathan leaned forward. "You do nothing. Not yet. Don't confront Vanessa. Let her believe you're confused. Maybe even frightened. People like her get careless when they think they've won." I left his office with my mind spinning. That night, back in the house, I stood in front of the bedroom closet for a long time. Behind the winter coats and old photo albums was the safe Maggie and I had installed years ago. I hadn't opened it since her funeral. The envelope from Helen sat on the dresser. I opened the safe first. Inside, nestled among familiar documents and jewelry boxes, was a red envelope I had never seen before. Maggie's handwriting was unmistakable. "For Robert, when you need strength." My hands shook as I carried it to the bed. Inside was a letter and a thick folder of documents. I opened the letter first. "My dearest Robert," Maggie had written. "If you're reading this, then what I feared has finally happened." Her words poured out across the pages. Love, apology, clarity. She wrote about Vanessa, about the way she watched people like assets, about her fear that my kindness would be used against me. She wrote about the trust, about Thomas, her cousin at the bank, about Jonathan. She wrote that kindness without boundaries is an invitation to be used. By the time I finished reading, tears blurred the page. Maggie had seen everything. The folder contained 5 years of notes, dates, small incidents, patterns I had dismissed. It wasn't paranoia, it was preparation. The next mistake Vanessa made came sooner than Jonathan expected. Within 48 hours, I began to feel watched. A car that looked like Andrew's followed me briefly, then turned away. A vehicle parked too long at the end of my street. On a cold Thursday morning, I found it, a small magnetic GPS tracker attached beneath my truck. I photographed it and called Jonathan immediately. "Leave it there," he said. "Let her think she's still in control." The following day, I went to the bank again to speak with Thomas. I had barely stepped through the doors when I heard her voice. Vanessa strode in, heels clicking sharply against the marble floor, demanding to speak with the manager. She claimed she was helping her elderly father-in-law manage his finances. Thomas remained calm. "Mrs. Miller, you have no authorization on these accounts," he said. "I can't assist you." Her composure cracked for a split second before she noticed me standing near the entrance. "Robert," she said sweetly, "I was just trying to clear up some confusion. Banking can be complicated at your age." I said nothing. I simply watched her. She left quickly, phone already pressed to her ear. That afternoon, Andrew called. He asked if we could meet for coffee. When we sat down, he reached for his wallet to pay, then froze, his face flushed. "Sabrina handles all our money," he whispered. "She gives me $50 a week." In that moment, something shifted. Andrew wasn't her partner. He was her prisoner. Andrew sat across from me in that small cafe, his hands wrapped tightly around a mug he hadn't touched. He kept his voice low, as if the walls themselves might be listening. "She says it's normal," he murmured, "that wives manage the money. That I'm lucky she's so organized." I studied my son's face, the hollow look in his eyes, the tension in his jaw. This wasn't the man I had raised to question things, to stand on his own feet. This was someone who had been slowly, methodically stripped of confidence. "How long has it been like this?" I asked. He shrugged, helpless. "I don't know. It happened gradually. First, she took over the bills. Then the savings. Then she said cash was better for budgeting. $50 a week." His voice cracked. "I don't even have access to our bank accounts anymore." The anger I'd been carrying toward Andrew began to dissolve, replaced by something far heavier: understanding. That evening, I brought the GPS tracker to Jonathan's office. He documented it carefully, photographing every angle, sealing it into an evidence bag. "She's crossed another line," he said, almost satisfied. "Surveillance, harassment. Judges don't like patterns like this." I drove home under a darkening sky, my thoughts circling back to Maggie's words. Kindness without boundaries is an invitation to be used. I had lived my life believing that patience and trust would protect me. Now I understood that they needed structure, defenses. That night, I stood again before the safe in the closet. There was one more envelope inside, tucked behind the documents I'd already read. Maggie's handwriting stared back at me. I opened it. Her letter was shorter this time, simpler. She told me she was proud of me, that if I was reading this, it meant I had fought back. And then she asked one last thing of me: not to live in fear or anger. Not to let betrayal define the rest of my life. "Live," she wrote. "That's how you win." The next day, Andrew showed up at my house unannounced. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. His clothes were wrinkled, his eyes red. "I found something," he said, setting his laptop on the kitchen table. "She forgot to log out of her email." He turned the screen toward me. The message was 6 years old, sent before Maggie got sick, before Andrew and Vanessa were even married. "If I marry Andrew, his father's house is the key." It read, "The property alone is worth $500,000. The old man won't last forever." I read it twice, 3 times. The words didn't change. Andrew's voice broke. "I didn't know, Dad. I swear. When I confronted her, she threatened me, said she'd destroy me if I told you." That was the moment I saw the full shape of the trap. Vanessa hadn't just stolen money. She had built a prison around my son, around my life, brick by brick, using fear and shame as mortar. Jonathan listened carefully as Andrew told his story later that afternoon. When he finished, Jonathan leaned forward, eyes sharp with focus. "Your testimony changes everything," he said. "You're not an accomplice. You're a victim, and victims who speak are powerful." Andrew swallowed hard. "She'll ruin me." "She already has," Jonathan replied gently. "The question is whether you let her keep doing it." Andrew moved into my guest room that night. Vanessa called nonstop. He didn't answer. He simply turned the phone off and placed it in a drawer, as if sealing away a chapter of his life. The investigation accelerated. Jonathan dug into Vanessa's past and found what Maggie had suspected all along. 8 years earlier, a former boyfriend had accused her of draining his accounts. The complaint vanished quietly. Money changed hands. Threats were made. And then there was her father. George Carter had once been wealthy. Real estate, investments, comfort. He died nearly penniless. Jonathan uncovered records showing assets transferred under suspicious circumstances. Signatures that didn't quite match. Patterns that echoed my own situation with chilling familiarity. "She's done this before," Jonathan said, "and she won't stop unless someone stops her." That someone, it seemed, was us. A few days later, Jonathan called me with urgency in his voice. "Vanessa and her brother have booked one-way tickets to Canada," he said. "They're planning to run." The next 72 hours blurred together. Emergency filings, court motions, phone calls that stretched late into the night. Then the judge issued the injunction. Accounts frozen, passports flagged. They weren't going anywhere. Vanessa panicked. She tried accessing my accounts again, blocked. She stormed the bank, documented. She sent emails to authorities accusing me of dementia and manipulation, traced back to her computer within hours. Each move only tightened the net. Her brother was arrested at the airport first. He talked immediately, desperate to save himself. When Jonathan called to tell me, I sat in the living room staring at Maggie's photograph, her white lilies glowing in the evening light. "She planned all of it," Jonathan said, "from the beginning." The hearing came fast. Vanessa arrived in court dressed in innocence. Eyes red, voice trembling. She painted herself as a devoted wife caring for an aging father-in-law. Her attorney spoke of confusion, generosity, misunderstanding. Then Jonathan began. Transaction records, forged documents, surveillance footage, emails, Andrew's testimony, her brother's confession. Piece by piece, the story she had built collapsed. And then Vanessa spoke. In her rage, she admitted the truth. "We waited years for him to die," she screamed. The courtroom went silent. The judge didn't hesitate. Vanessa was taken away in handcuffs. I didn't feel triumph, I felt tired. But for the first time in a long while, I also felt free. The courtroom emptied slowly after Vanessa was taken away, the echo of her outburst still hanging in the air like smoke after a fire. Lawyers gathered their files. Bailiffs guided people toward the exits. Conversations resumed in low, cautious tones, as if everyone sensed they had just witnessed something that would stay with them for a long time. I remained seated, my hands resting on my knees, unsure when I had stopped shaking. Andrew stood beside me, silent, his shoulders slumped as if the adrenaline that had carried him through his testimony had finally drained away. Jonathan placed a hand lightly on my arm. "It's not over," he said quietly, "but the hardest part is behind you." Outside, the winter air cut sharply against my face. I inhaled deeply, the cold filling my lungs, grounding me. For months, years, really, I had felt as though I were slowly suffocating under something I couldn't name. Now, even with everything unresolved, I could breathe again. The weeks that followed were strange, suspended between relief and exhaustion. Vanessa remained in federal custody, denied bail. Her brother, Ryan, was being held separately, cooperating fully with investigators in exchange for leniency. Each day brought new phone calls, new documents, new confirmations of what Maggie had known all along. Jonathan explained that the case would go to full trial, that restitution would take time, that there would be depositions, evaluations, and more hearings. It sounded endless. But for the first time since Maggie died, I didn't feel alone navigating it. Andrew stayed in the guest room, moving through the house like someone relearning how to exist without permission. He flinched whenever his phone buzzed, even though Vanessa could no longer contact him. At night, I sometimes heard him pacing, footsteps soft but restless above the hum of the furnace. One evening, I found him sitting at the kitchen table, staring at nothing. "I don't know who I am without her telling me," he admitted quietly. "Every decision feels wrong." I understood more than I wished I did. Betrayal doesn't just steal money. It erodes instinct, confidence, trust in one's own judgment. "You'll find your footing again," I told him, "not all at once, but you will." Some days, I wasn't sure if I was reassuring him or myself. A letter arrived from the court notifying me that the forged loan against my house had been officially voided. Jonathan called to confirm it was secure under Maggie's trust exactly as she had planned. When I hung up the phone, I stood in the living room for a long time. my hand resting against the wall, feeling the solidness of it beneath my palm. This house would not be taken from me. A few days later, another letter arrived, this one in careful, uneven handwriting. Lily. She wrote that she was confused, that her mother was in trouble, that her father cried sometimes when he thought she was asleep. She asked if she could come visit, if I still wanted to see her. I read the letter twice, then once more, my throat tightening. I wrote back immediately, telling her the truth as gently as I could, that grown-ups sometimes make terrible choices, that none of this was her fault, that my door was open whenever she wanted to walk through it. Andrew watched me seal the envelope, his eyes wet. She deserves better than what she's been given, he said. So do you, I replied. The sentencing hearing was scheduled weeks later. I attended every preliminary session, sitting quietly behind Jonathan, listening as my life was dissected into evidence and exhibits. The dates blurred together, but one thing remained constant: the steady accumulation of proof. Vanessa's attorney tried to delay, tried to soften the narrative, tried to reframe her actions as desperation rather than predation. It didn't work. The paper trail was too clean, the pattern too consistent. On the morning of sentencing, I brought Maggie's photograph with me, tucked safely into my jacket pocket. I didn't know why, I just felt like she should be there. Vanessa stood when the judge entered, her posture rigid, her eyes hollow. Gone was the confidence, the calculation. In its place was something flat and empty. She didn't look at Andrew. She didn't look at me. When the judge spoke, his words were calm and deliberate. He spoke of breach of trust, of systematic abuse, of the particular cruelty of exploiting family under the guise of care. 8 years. No early release. Full restitution. The sound of the gavel felt final in a way I hadn't expected. Not dramatic, just definitive. I closed my eyes for a moment and thought of Maggie's letter. Live, she had written, "That's how you win." Andrew exhaled shakily beside me. "It's really over," he whispered. "It's really beginning," I said. In the weeks that followed, the house slowly filled with life again. Andrew found a small apartment nearby and began therapy, the kind designed for survivors of emotional and financial abuse. The word survivor took time for him to accept, but I saw the change in his eyes, subtle, fragile, real. Helen visited often, bringing food, conversation, quiet companionship. Thomas stopped by one afternoon with a bouquet of white lilies. His role finally understood, his promise to Maggie fulfilled. One Sunday, Lily came for dinner. She explored the house cautiously, as if stepping into a place she had only heard about in stories. I showed her the garden Maggie had loved, the lilies just beginning to bloom again. "She would have liked you," I told her. "I think she already does," Lily said softly. That night, after everyone had gone home, I stood by the window watching the last light fade over the hills. Maggie's photograph smiled back at me from the mantel, unchanged, steady. I wasn't whole again, not yet. But I was no longer broken. And for the first time in a long while, I believed that was enough to keep going. Spring came slowly to Vermont that year, as if the land itself needed time to recover from winter. Patches of snow lingered in the shade long after the roads were clear. And the mornings still carried a bite that reminded me not everything heals at once. Neither do people. Andrew visited every other day at first, sometimes with a clear purpose, dropping off paperwork Jonathan needed, asking a question about bills he was finally learning to manage himself, sometimes with no reason at all. He would sit at the kitchen table, staring out the window, absorbing the quiet like someone relearning how silence is supposed to feel. One afternoon, he said something that stopped me. "She used to tell me silence meant I'd done something wrong," he said. "If she wasn't talking, it meant I needed to apologize, or explain myself, or fix something I didn't understand." I nodded slowly. "Silence can be a weapon," I said, "or it can be peace. The difference is who controls it." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something settle in his expression. Not relief, not confidence, but recognition. The first time he paid his own bills. He called me afterward like a child announcing his first steps. He laughed, an awkward, uncertain sound, but it was real. The sound filled the kitchen, echoing faintly off the walls Maggie had once painted. That same week, Jonathan called to confirm the restitution process had officially begun. The money would come back in stages. Recovered from frozen accounts, seized assets, and court-ordered repayments. It would take time, but it would come. I know it's not about the money, he said, but it matters. He was right. It mattered not because of what it bought, but because of what it represented. Proof. Accountability. A line drawn where none had existed before. A few days later, I received a letter from Patricia Carter, Vanessa's mother. The handwriting was neat, controlled, as if she had rewritten the letter several times before sending it. She apologized for what her daughter had done, though she didn't ask for forgiveness. She said she had tried to stop it once. Years ago, when her husband was still alive. She failed. She lived with that failure every day. I see now that your wife saw what I refused to face. She wrote, for that, I am grateful to her. And sorry to you. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the safe, alongside Maggie's notes, not because I needed to preserve it, but because some truths deserve to be remembered without being revisited. Lily's visits became regular after that. At first, she stayed close to Andrew, uncertain, guarded. Then one Sunday afternoon, she wandered into the living room on her own and stopped in front of Maggie's photograph. She looks kind, Lily said. She was, I replied, very much so. Lily asked questions, about the garden, about the bridge designs I used to draw, about the stories Andrew had told her as a child but never fully explained. I answered honestly, carefully, never speaking ill of her mother, never lying to soften what couldn't be softened. Children don't need perfect explanations. They need truth shaped with care. One evening, after Lily had gone home, Andrew lingered by the door. I found an apartment, he said, not far. I think I'm ready. I felt the familiar tug of loss, followed quickly by pride. You are, I said, you've been ready longer than you think. He hesitated, then pulled me into a brief, awkward hug, the kind grown men don't practice often enough. When he stepped back, his eyes were wet, but steady. The house grew quieter after he moved out. Not empty, just honest. No tension humming beneath the floorboards. No waiting for the next disruption. Helen came by one afternoon with a pie, apple. Maggie's recipe. She didn't announce it. She never did. She simply set it on the counter and sat down as if she had always belonged there. She planned everything, Helen said softly, glancing at Maggie's photograph. Even this. She told me you'd need reminding to eat. I smiled despite myself. That night, after Helen left, I opened the last letter Maggie had written. The one I had saved for when the noise finally stopped. She told me she was proud. Not of the fight, not of the outcome, but of my willingness to see the truth when it finally stood in front of me. She told me not to confuse endurance with strength, or sacrifice with love. Choose yourself, she had written, not because others failed you, but because you are still here. I slept better that night than I had in years. The final hearing came quietly, without drama, paperwork finalized, signatures completed, accounts restored. It felt less like a victory and more like the closing of a long, painful chapter. When I walked out of the courthouse for the last time, Helen was waiting at the bottom of the steps, white lilies in her hands, the same ones Maggie loved. She'd be proud of you, Helen said. I nodded, unable to speak. That Sunday, I hosted dinner again. Andrew came early to help cook. Lily brought a drawing she'd made of the house with flowers blooming around it. Helen arrived with wine. Thomas stopped by briefly, respectful, smiling. The table filled. Laughter followed. Stories emerged, some old, some new. For the first time since Maggie's funeral, the house didn't feel like a place holding its breath. Later, after everyone left, I stood by the window watching the sun dip below the hills. The lilies glowed softly in the fading light. Maggie's photograph watched over the room, unchanged, familiar. I'm living, I said quietly, like you asked. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was peaceful. And for the first time in a long time, I understood what real revenge looked like. It wasn't destruction. It was survival, with dignity intact. Life didn't snap back into place all at once. It never does. Healing, I learned, is quieter than pain. It doesn't announce itself. It shows up in small, ordinary moments that would have gone unnoticed before. Like the first morning I woke up and didn't immediately reach for Maggie's photograph to apologize for surviving another day without her. Like the afternoon I realized I hadn't checked my bank balance in weeks, not out of fear. Not out of vigilance, but because I finally trusted that what was mine was safe again. Spring settled fully over Vermont. The lilies Maggie had planted years ago bloomed beside the new ones I'd added. Their white petals crowding together as if they had always belonged side by side. I spent more time outside, hands in the soil, back aching pleasantly in a way that reminded me I was still alive. Still capable of building things, even if now those things were small and temporary. Andrew found his rhythm. Therapy wasn't easy for him. Some days he came over angry, other days exhausted, occasionally hopeful in a way that felt fragile but real. He was learning how deeply manipulation can root itself inside a person. How long it takes to untangle guilt from responsibility. I keep thinking I should have known, he admitted once, sitting across from me on the porch, that if I was smarter, stronger, I wouldn't have let it happen. I shook my head. That's what abusers teach you to believe. I said, that awareness is the same thing as control. It isn't. He absorbed that quietly. Andrew had always been a thinker. Now he was learning how to think kindly about himself. Lily's visits became the anchor of my weeks. She started calling me Grandpa again. Tentative at first, then with growing ease. We baked cookies together, burned the first batch, laughed over it, tried again. She asked questions about Maggie, real questions. Not the careful ones adults think children prefer. What was Grandma afraid of? She asked one afternoon, not looking at me as she spoke. I considered the question carefully. She was afraid of people being hurt when they trusted the wrong ones. I said, but she also believed people could heal if they were honest with themselves. Lily nodded, as if that made perfect sense. Vanessa's name faded from our daily conversations, not because we pretended she hadn't existed, but because she no longer controlled the narrative. Court updates arrived occasionally, formal and impersonal. 8 years meant 8 years. That was no longer my burden to carry. One afternoon, I received a short note from Jonathan Reed informing me the final portion of restitution had been completed. Every dollar returned, every record corrected. He added a line at the bottom, handwritten. Your wife was extraordinary. It was an honor to help her keep her promise. I folded the note and placed it beside Maggie's letters. Some people leave behind memories. Others leave behind protection. Maggie had done both. Helen remained a constant presence. She never tried to fill Maggie's place. She didn't need to. She simply showed up, sometimes with pie, sometimes with conversation, sometimes with silence that didn't demand anything from me. One evening, as we sat watching the sun sink behind the hills, she said, you know, she worried you'd disappear into yourself after everything. I smiled faintly. She underestimated her own influence. Helen smiled back. No, she trusted it. That night, after Helen left, I stood alone in the living room. Maggie's photograph rested on the mantel. The same smile frozen in time. For the first time, I didn't feel the urge to explain myself to it. Instead, I told her about my plans. About traveling somewhere she'd always wanted to see. About maybe teaching Lily how to garden. About living not cautiously, not defensively, but deliberately. I'll be careful, I said softly, but I won't be small. The words felt right. Months later, on a warm summer evening, the house was full again. Andrew cooked, badly, but enthusiastically. Lily set the table. Helen laughed from the kitchen. Thomas stopped by briefly, declining dinner but staying long enough to admire the garden. The sound of voices filled the rooms Maggie and I had once walked through alone. Hand in hand, I realized then that the house hadn't been saved just by legal documents or careful planning. It had been saved by truth. By boundaries. By the courage to stop pretending that love excuses everything. When the night wound down and the last light faded from the sky, I stepped outside alone. The air was soft, the kind that carries the promise of tomorrow without demanding certainty. I thought back to the day Andrew stood in my kitchen and told me everything was gone. How small I had felt. How finished. They thought they had taken everything from me. They were wrong. They hadn't taken my dignity. They hadn't taken my future. They hadn't taken the quiet strength Maggie had planted in me long before any of this began. That was the real inheritance. And it was more than enough to start again. The first time I traveled alone after everything happened, I almost turned the car around twice before reaching the highway. Habit is a powerful thing. For years, my life had narrowed quietly, first out of grief, then out of accommodation, then out of fear I didn't know how to name. Even freedom can feel unfamiliar when you haven't held it in a long time. I drove north, no destination in mind at first, just the road stretching ahead and the radio playing softly in the background. Maggie had always loved road trips. She believed movement cleared the mind, that you couldn't stay trapped in one place emotionally if your body kept going forward. As the miles passed, I felt her with me, not as sorrow, not as memory, but as momentum. When I returned home a few days later, the house greeted me differently, not with silence that asked questions, but with quiet that felt settled, lived in, chosen. Andrew had stopped by while I was gone. He left a note on the counter, written in his careful handwriting, telling me he'd fixed a loose step on the porch and stocked the fridge. At the bottom, he added, "I didn't ask permission. I hope that's okay." I smiled longer than I expected. That summer, Andrew finalized the divorce. No drama, no spectacle. Vanessa didn't fight it. By then, the fight had left her. What remained was process, paperwork, inevitability. Andrew told me he felt strange signing his name, like he was closing a door he'd forgotten he was allowed to open. "I don't feel free yet," he admitted one evening, "but I don't feel trapped either." "That's how it starts," I told him. "Freedom comes quietly, like trust." Lily stayed with me for a week in August. We established routines, morning walks, afternoon reading, evenings in the garden. One night, as we sat on the porch watching fireflies blink on and off in the dark, she asked a question that made my chest tighten. "Grandpa," she said, "do you think my mom is bad?" I thought carefully before answering. "I think your mother made choices that hurt people," I said, "and she didn't stop when she should have. But that doesn't define who you are." Lily nodded, absorbing that in her own way. "Grandma wouldn't want me to hate her," she added. "No," I agreed. "She'd want you to be honest. And kind. To yourself most of all." As the seasons shifted again, I found myself speaking to Maggie less out of necessity and more out of habit, an affectionate one. I still watered her lilies every morning, still told her about my days. But now the conversations carried laughter again, plans, observations about the world that had nothing to do with loss. One afternoon, Helen joined me in the garden, hands in the dirt, quiet between us, comfortable. "You know," she said, "she didn't just protect you from harm. She trusted you to rise when it came." I considered that. I didn't feel strong, I admitted. Helen smiled. "Strong people rarely do." That winter, I volunteered at a local community center, teaching basic financial planning to retirees. Nothing formal, just conversations, shared stories, warnings delivered gently, without bitterness. I didn't tell them my story unless they asked. I didn't need to. The lessons spoke for themselves. Kindness needs boundaries. Trust should be earned. Love doesn't require surrender. On the anniversary of Maggie's death, I didn't visit the cemetery right away. Instead, I cooked dinner, set the table, lit a candle beside her photograph. Andrew came over. So did Lily. Helen brought dessert. We shared stories the way we always had, messy, warm, imperfect. Later that night, after everyone left, I drove to the cemetery alone. I stood beside Maggie's headstone, the cold air sharp but familiar. "I kept my promise," I said quietly. "I didn't disappear." The wind moved softly through the trees. I didn't wait for a sign. I didn't need one. As I turned to leave, I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't angry anymore. Not at Vanessa. Not at the betrayal. Not even at myself. What remained wasn't revenge. It was clarity. They had tried to erase me slowly, quietly, counting on my silence, My age, my love to make it easy. They thought taking my money would take my power. They thought patience meant weakness. They were wrong. Real revenge doesn't shout. It doesn't destroy. It doesn't need witnesses. It lives well. It protects what matters. It refuses to disappear. And that, I've learned, is the most dangerous thing of all. There was a moment, months later, when I realized I no longer introduced myself as a widower in my own mind. I was still Maggie's husband. That would never change. But I was also something else again, a man with a present. Not just a past he was guarding carefully. The shift was subtle. It happened one ordinary morning while I stood at the kitchen sink, watching sunlight spill across the counter, and noticed I was humming without realizing it. Life had found a way back in. Andrew called more often now, not because he needed advice or reassurance, but because he wanted to share things. A breakthrough in therapy, a bad day at work that didn't spiral into self-blame, a moment when he caught himself hesitating before making a decision, and then made it anyway. I didn't ask anyone if it was okay, he said once, half laughing. I just did it. That's how you know you're healing, I replied. Lily grew taller, louder, more certain of herself with every visit. She stopped asking permission to explore the house. She claimed the guest room as hers. She argued with me about books, about music, about whether the garden needed more color. I welcomed every disagreement. They were signs of safety, of trust. One afternoon, she handed me a folded piece of paper. Inside was a drawing, 3 figures standing in front of the house. One with gray hair, one taller, thinner, one smaller, smiling. Above them, she had written a single word in careful letters: home. I pinned it to the refrigerator. That winter, I was asked to speak at a local support group for seniors, nothing formal. Just a conversation. I stood in front of a small circle of people who looked a lot like I had once felt, careful, quiet, unsure whether they were allowed to take up space anymore. I told them what I wished someone had told me sooner. That love doesn't require you to disappear. That family isn't defined by blood alone, but by behavior. That asking for help is not a failure of character, but an act of self-respect. I didn't mention Vanessa by name. I didn't need to. Her absence was the point. Afterward, a woman approached me, her hands trembling slightly as she spoke. I thought it was just me, she said, the way my son talks to me, the way he handles my money. I gave her Jonathan's card. Talk to someone, I said, quietly, carefully, but don't ignore your instincts. Driving home that night, I felt something settle into place. The story hadn't ended when justice was served. It had widened, become useful. On the first anniversary of the trial's conclusion, Andrew and Lily joined me for dinner. Helen came too, as she always did, carrying a dish Maggie had taught her to make. We ate slowly, talked easily. No one avoided hard subjects. No one rushed to fill the silence. At one point, Andrew raised his glass. To Mom, he said, for seeing what we couldn't, and for trusting us to grow into the truth. We sat quietly after that, each of us holding our own memories, our own gratitude. Later, when the house was empty again, I stood by the mantel, Maggie's photograph glowing softly in the lamplight. The lilies beside it were fresh, their scent filling the room. They didn't win, I said aloud, not the way they thought. I understood now what had truly saved me. Not the bank manager. Not the lawyer. Not even the evidence. It was the refusal to become smaller in order to keep the peace. It was the decision to stop apologizing for existing. It was the courage to let the truth be known, even when it was painful. Silence had once been my weakness. Now, it was my strength. Because silence, when chosen, is not submission. It is control. And that is how my story ends, not with bitterness, not with triumph, but with something far rarer. A life reclaimed. I used to believe that endings announced themselves, that there would be a clear moment when everything finally felt finished. Closure, I thought, would arrive like a door clicking shut behind me. What I learned instead is that real endings are quieter. They don't ask for attention. They simply stop hurting. It happened one afternoon in early autumn. The maples along the road were beginning to turn, their leaves catching fire in shades of red and gold. I was raking the yard, moving slowly, deliberately, when I realized I wasn't rushing anymore. Not to escape my thoughts. Not to outrun memory. Just working, breathing, existing in the present moment without bracing for impact. That was when I knew the story had changed. Andrew had settled fully into his new life. He spoke about the future now, not in vague terms. Not with fear, but with plans. A promotion he was considering. A trip he wanted to take with Lily. The possibility of dating again. Someday, when it felt right. He no longer asked me whether his choices were reasonable. He simply shared them. "I trust myself again," he said one evening, almost surprised by the words. I nodded, understanding the weight of that admission. Trust, once broken, doesn't return all at once. It rebuilds quietly, decision by decision, until one day you realize it's there again, steady beneath your feet. Lily grew into the house as if it had always been hers. She helped me replant the garden, choosing colors Maggie would have loved. She argued passionately for purple flowers because, as she put it, white is beautiful, but it shouldn't be lonely. I let her lead. Some things deserve to be decided by those who will carry them forward. On Sundays, the table filled easily now. Helen's laughter mixed with Andrew's. Lily told stories from school. Thomas stopped by when he could, never staying long, never making himself the center of attention. The house learned new rhythms, new voices, without losing the old ones. Maggie's photograph remained on the mantel, unchanged, but the way I looked at it had shifted. I no longer searched her eyes for guidance or reassurance. I felt it already inside me. One evening, after everyone had gone, I opened the safe one last time. I took out Maggie's letters, her notes, the careful protections she had built. I read them slowly, not with urgency, but with gratitude. Then I placed them back, closed the door, and turned the lock. Not because I was afraid of forgetting, but because I no longer needed proof to remember who she was, or who I had become. In the weeks that followed, people began reaching out, friends of friends, neighbors, quiet voices asking quiet questions. About finances, about family, about whether it was possible to start over when you felt too old, too tired, too late. I never told them what to do. I only told them what I had learned. That love doesn't demand your silence. That loyalty is not the same as surrender. That being kind does not mean being available for exploitation. Most of all, I told them this: if someone makes you feel smaller so they can feel secure, that is not love. That is theft, of dignity, of agency, of self. Winter came again, as it always does. Snow settled gently over the garden, covering the earth Maggie had tended and Lily had replanted. I stood at the window one morning, coffee in hand, watching the flakes fall, and felt a quiet satisfaction I had never known before. I was not waiting anymore. Not for apologies that would never come. Not for explanations that would never be enough. Not for the world to make sense of what had happened. I had made sense of it myself. They thought they had taken everything from me. They were wrong. What they failed to understand was this: a man who has survived betrayal and chosen not to harden is far more dangerous than someone who seeks revenge. Because he knows who he is. Because he knows where his boundaries lie. Because he will never again confuse silence with submission. If you are listening to this and something in it feels familiar, I want you to hear one thing clearly. You are not foolish for trusting. You are not weak for loving. But you owe it to yourself to protect what you have built: your life, your peace, your future. Justice doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it comes quietly, patiently, and stays. My name is Robert Miller. I am not what they tried to take from me. I am what remained.